Have you ever wondered what it would be like to wake up with a toothache in the year 1347? No dentist to call. No painkillers in your medicine cabinet. Just you, the throbbing pain, and perhaps a barber with a pair of rusty pliers waiting to yank that tooth out of your jaw without a single drop of anesthesia. Or imagine this: you're lying in bed with a fever, and instead of receiving medicine, someone approaches you with a sharp blade. They're not there to harm you. They're there to heal you. By opening your veins and draining pints of your blood into a bowl. Welcome to medieval medicine, a world where the cures were often more terrifying than the diseases themselves. If you enjoy what I do here, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Your support helps me create more stories like this one. Let's travel back together to a time between the 5th and 15th centuries, the period we call the Middle Ages, a time when Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms, where castles dominated the landscape, where the church held enormous power over daily life, and where the average person could expect to live perhaps 30 or 40 years if they were fortunate. This was a world without microscopes, without any understanding of germs or bacteria. The invisible enemies that caused so much suffering remained completely unknown. Instead, medieval physicians relied on theories inherited from ancient Greek and Roman doctors, particularly a man named Galen, who lived in the 2nd century of the Common Era. Galen taught that the human body contained 4 essential fluids, which he called humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These 4 humors corresponded to the 4 elements: air, water, fire, and earth, and to the 4 qualities of hot, cold, moist, and dry. When these humors existed in perfect balance, you were healthy. When they fell out of balance, you became sick. It was that simple, or so they believed. This theory shaped every aspect of medieval medicine for over 1,000 years. It determined how doctors diagnosed illness, what treatments they prescribed, what foods they recommended, and even how they interpreted your personality and emotions. And here's the shocking twist that you need to understand before we go any further. This theory, as logical as it seemed to medieval minds, was completely wrong. But imagine yourself in that world for just a moment. You're living in a time when a simple cut on your hand could lead to an infection that kills you. When women faced a terrifying risk every time they gave birth. When epidemics could sweep through entire villages in a matter of weeks, leaving half the population dead in their wake. You wake one morning feeling unwell. Perhaps you have a headache, or your stomach aches, or you're burning with fever. You don't have the luxury of walking to a pharmacy or scheduling a doctor's appointment. If you're poor, and most people were poor in medieval times, you might try to treat yourself with herbs from your garden. Mint for your upset stomach, garlic for wounds, lavender for your headache. These remedies were passed down through generations, from mother to daughter, from village healer to apprentice. If you're wealthy enough to afford a physician, he might examine you in ways that seem bizarre to our modern minds. He'll ask to see your urine, not just glance at it, but study it intensely, holding the flask up to the light, examining its color, its clarity, its smell, perhaps even tasting it to understand the truth hidden within. From this examination alone, he believes he can diagnose what ails you, which humor has fallen out of balance, and what treatment will restore your health. And the treatment? Well, that's where things get truly shocking. Because in the medieval world, healing often looked like harm. Bloodletting, deliberately cutting open your veins to drain significant amounts of your blood, was considered the most effective cure for countless ailments. Fever? Bloodletting. Headache? Bloodletting. Pneumonia? Inflammation? Mental disturbance? The answer was almost always the same: you had too much blood and it needed to be removed. Some patients had 8 ounces drained. Some had 16. Some had 24 ounces or more taken from their bodies over the course of a single illness. When King Charles II suffered a seizure in the year 1685, his physicians immediately bled 16 ounces from his arm, then another 8 ounces through cupping, then more from his jugular veins. In total, they removed approximately 24 ounces before he died. They believed they were helping him. They were almost certainly hastening his death. If you needed a tooth extracted, you'd visit not a dentist, but a barber. The same man who cut your hair would also pull your teeth, perform minor surgeries, and drain your abscesses, all with the same basic tools and no anesthesia except perhaps a strong drink. The pain must have been extraordinary. The risk of infection, enormous. If you broke a bone, if you developed a terrible headache that wouldn't stop, if you suffered seizures or showed signs of mental illness, someone might suggest drilling a hole directly into your skull. This procedure, called trepanation, was performed with a drill or a saw, slowly boring through the bone to expose the membrane beneath. The theory was that it would release pressure or allow evil spirits to escape or cure the affliction by giving it an exit route. Remarkably, many people survived this brutal operation. In modern times, you can walk into a hospital and expect sterile instruments, trained specialists, and medications developed through decades of scientific research. You expect doctors who understand how infections spread, how organs function, and how diseases progress through the body. You expect, quite reasonably, that medicine will help you, not harm you. But in medieval times, the people who came to you promising healing often had no more knowledge than you did. They simply had confidence, tradition, and theories that had never been properly tested. They meant well. They truly believed they were helping. But they were working in the dark, fumbling toward answers that would not arrive for centuries. Could you have survived in their world? Would you have had the strength to endure a tooth extraction without anesthesia? Would you have submitted to bloodletting when the physician assured you it was your only hope? Would you have been brave enough or desperate enough to allow someone to drill into your skull? Tonight, we're going to explore that world together. We'll walk through the diseases that terrified medieval people, from the common ailments that made daily life miserable to the great plagues that swept across continents, killing millions. We'll witness the treatments they used, some based on careful observation and genuine attempts to heal, others rooted in superstition, desperation, and catastrophic misunderstanding of how the human body works. We'll visit the birthing chamber, where women labored surrounded by midwives whose knowledge came from experience, not books, and where both mother and child face dangers that seem unthinkable today. We'll enter the barber surgeon's chair, where a simple toothache could become a nightmare of pain and blood. We'll peer into the physician's urine flask and try to understand how learned men could believe they saw the secrets of health and disease swirling in that golden liquid. And we'll discover something that might surprise you, that medieval people weren't as dirty and careless about their health as we often imagine. That they bathed more regularly than legend suggests, that they understood the value of cleanliness even if they didn't understand germs, and that they showed remarkable ingenuity in trying to combat the diseases that plagued them. This is a journey through pain and suffering, yes, but it's also a journey through human resilience, through our ancestors' determination to survive against terrible odds, and through the slow, difficult process by which humanity gradually learned to heal rather than harm. So settle in, get comfortable. Let your mind drift back across the centuries to a world very different from ours, a world of stone castles and thatched cottages, of herb gardens and leper colonies, of bloodletting bowls and trepanation drills, of birth stools and plague masks, of four humors and urine flasks. A world where disease was a constant companion, where pain was endured because there was no alternative, and where the remedies that were meant to save you might very well kill you instead. Let's begin. When we think of medieval death, we imagine the Black Death. We picture corpses piled in mass graves, entire cities emptied by plague, the end of the world as people knew it. And yes, the plague killed millions across 3 centuries of recurring epidemics. But here's a startling fact that historians have only recently come to understand through careful analysis of skeletal remains, historical records, and burial data. The plague was not the biggest killer of the medieval world. In fact, ordinary, everyday illnesses, diseases that barely register in our modern consciousness, were far more deadly to the average person. Imagine you are a merchant's child in the year 1300. You live in a narrow-windowed house in London or Paris or Florence. The streets outside smell of human and animal waste, of rotting food, of unwashed bodies pressed closely together. Your stomach has been cramping since this morning, and you've made several trips to the chamber pot in the courtyard. What you don't know is that you're experiencing dysentery, an intestinal infection caused by bacteria in contaminated water or spoiled food. Your body is rejecting everything you put into it. Water, bread, even the weak ale that medieval people drank because it was safer than water. All of it comes pouring out of you in painful, liquid urgency. The pain is extraordinary. It feels as though someone is twisting your intestines with their bare hands. Your stomach convulses and heaves. You're feverish, sweating through your linen undergarments. Your mother brings you broth, thinking nourishment will help, but your body cannot hold it. The cycle of cramping and evacuation continues throughout the day and into the night. A physician is called. He examines your urine, of course he does, and finds it to be brownish and turbid, which he interprets as a terrible imbalance of humors. He prescribes bloodletting to relieve the excessive heat in your body. A barber comes with his lancet. They slice open the vein in your inner arm, and blood pours into a basin. You're already weak from dehydration, and now you're being weakened further by the loss of blood. But this is what they believe will save you. This is the standard medical treatment of the age. Dysentery killed thousands upon thousands in medieval Europe. It thrived in the filthy conditions of crowded medieval cities and towns. It was especially devastating during the warmer months, when food spoiled more quickly and when the stench of the streets seemed to hang permanently in the air. Dysentery was so common that it barely merited mention in most historical records. It was simply part of life, part of dying. But dysentery was only one of the everyday killers. Measles swept through towns every few years, particularly deadly to children under 7. Smallpox left survivors disfigured and blind. Whooping cough made infants turn blue as they struggled to breathe. Typhoid fever burned through families like a quiet fire. Influenza, scarlet fever, gastrointestinal infections of every description, the list goes on and on. These were the diseases that shaped the medieval world far more than any single epidemic. They killed children in their thousands, claiming perhaps 1 in 3 before they reached their 5th birthday. They killed strong young adults in their prime. They killed the elderly and the weak. They were relentless and unavoidable. Consider for a moment what this meant for medieval families. Every parent watched their children with a kind of fearful anticipation. Will this one survive to adulthood? Will my daughter reach marriageable age? Will my son live long enough to learn the family trade? It was not a matter of if a child would become ill, it was a matter of when and whether their small body could survive the sickness. The medieval world was a world of death, death so common and so expected that people developed a kind of grim fatalism about it. When a child fell ill, mothers did what they could. They made herbal remedies. They prayed. They consulted healers and physicians if they could afford them. They whispered prayers to saints, hoping that spiritual intervention might accomplish what medicine could not. But ultimately, they waited, they watched, and they prepared for loss. Today, measles is something you get vaccinated against as a child. Smallpox has been eradicated from the earth. Typhoid is a rarity in developed nations. Whooping cough is prevented by vaccination. These diseases that once killed millions are now merely historical curiosities to most of us. But in the medieval world, they were an inescapable reality. They were part of the fabric of existence. And when they came for your family member, all the prayers and physicians and bloodletting in the world might not be enough to stop them. There is perhaps no disease in medieval history that inspired more terror and more pity than leprosy, not because it was the fastest killer, not because it affected the most people, but because of what it did to the body, slowly, relentlessly, visibly destroying the person from the outside in. Imagine you begin to notice a small patch of pale skin on your arm. It doesn't hurt. You can poke at it, and you feel nothing at all, a strange numbness in the shape of a small circle. At first, you think nothing of it. Perhaps it's merely a minor ailment. Perhaps it will go away. But the weeks pass, and more patches appear. Your eyebrows begin to thin and eventually disappear entirely. Your skin develops a thickened, shiny appearance. Your nose begins to collapse inward as the cartilage is destroyed. Your fingers and toes become numb and begin to lose their sensitivity. You can cut yourself without noticing. Wounds refuse to heal. Your limbs begin to contract and twist. The progression is slow, horrifyingly slow. It might take years for the worst of the deformity to appear, but everyone around you sees it. They see your changing face. They see the way your fingers are curling into claws. They see a living preview of death itself. Medieval people didn't understand leprosy. They believed it was a curse, either a punishment from God for some hidden sin, or perhaps the result of corrupt humors that had begun to rot from within your body. They didn't know it was caused by bacteria. They didn't know that it was not terribly contagious. They only knew that it was horrifying, progressive, and incurable. In medieval law and custom, a leper was essentially already dead. Once the disease was confirmed, you were expelled from normal society. You couldn't work in your family trade. You couldn't attend church services with other worshipers. You couldn't touch another person without warning them of your condition first. You were, in the eyes of your community, a walking death. And yet, the medieval church, that great institution which viewed leprosy as divine punishment, also established thousands of leprosaria across Europe to care for the afflicted. These were not the dungeons of popular legend, but rather communities sometimes called lazarettes, after the biblical figure Lazarus, where lepers could live with others like themselves, where they received food and shelter and care. In many ways, a leprosarium was like a monastery. The inhabitants followed a structured day. They attended chapel. They worked in the gardens when their condition allowed. They received visitors, family members, and friends came to see their sick loved ones, though always across a distance or through a barrier. Some leprosaria were run by kind benefactors who ensured their residents were treated with compassion. Others were harsh places where the dying were left to fend for themselves. For many lepers, the leprosarium was a kind of sanctuary. Outside, they would be shunned and feared. Inside, they lived among others who understood their condition, who didn't recoil in horror at the sight of their twisted fingers or collapsed noses. They had a community. They had purpose, however diminished. They had an environment that treated them as human beings, sick human beings, yes, but human nonetheless. But this compassion was not universal. In some places and sometimes, lepers were treated with appalling cruelty. They were forced to wear bells or carry wooden clappers to announce their approach. They were forbidden from entering towns. They were accused of poisoning wells, a charge that led to brutal persecution. After the Black Death devastated Europe in the mid-1400s, medieval society became even more fearful of contagion, and the treatment of lepers became harsher. This is the paradox of leprosy in the medieval world. It was a disease that inspired both compassion and cruelty, that moved people to establish institutions of care while simultaneously driving them to terrible acts of persecution. It was a disease that didn't kill quickly, but rather destroyed slowly, visibly, inexorably. And it was a disease that made the afflicted into living symbols of human mortality and the fragility of the flesh. In the year 1347, merchants from the trading city of Genoa were conducting business on the northern coast of the Black Sea when a conflict erupted between them and the local Muslim population. The Muslim forces laid siege to the Genoese settlement, and for days the two sides faced off across a wall. But something was happening within the Muslim camp. A disease strange, terrifying, and utterly unknown was beginning to kill the besieging army. Soldiers began to fall ill. Their lymph nodes swelled grotesquely. They developed fevers so high that their skin seemed to burn. Their fingers and toes turned black as the tissue died while they were still alive. They coughed blood. They died screaming. In what may have been an act of primitive biological warfare, though the Muslims had no understanding that disease could be weaponized this way, the dying were catapulted over the walls of the Genoese settlement. Corpses and the infected landed within the city. The Genoese, terrified and desperate, loaded their ships and fled back to Italy. But they were taking something with them. They were carrying the plague. The ships arrived in Sicily in the fall of 1347. Some of those on board were already showing signs of illness. Within weeks, the plague had spread to Italian port cities. From there, it moved inland. It followed trade routes. It followed armies. It followed merchant caravans. Within 5 years, it had reached from Spain to Russia, from North Africa to Scandinavia. The medieval world had never known anything like it. Picture yourself living in a major city during 1350, when the plague is at its height. The smell is overwhelming, a mixture of sickness and death and desperation so thick that you can taste it on your tongue. The streets are quiet, which is worse than if they were full, because everyone is locked in their homes, praying, trying not to catch this thing that seems to be everywhere. A physician in full protective gear stands in the street, a figure that would seem almost comical if it weren't so terrifying. He wears a long coat, waxed to repel what he believes are the disease-carrying miasmas floating through the air. His hands are covered in leather gloves. On his face, he wears a mask, a grotesque thing, with a long beak-like nose filled with herbs and spices believed to filter out the poison. His eyes look at you through 2 circular openings, and they are the eyes of a man who knows he may not survive this plague himself. But the physician's precautions are utterly useless against the true enemy. The plague is spread by rats and the fleas that live upon them. Medieval people, living in conditions of profound filth and overcrowding, are providing perfect conditions for the rats to thrive. The fleas are jumping from rats to humans, biting them, infecting them with the bacterium Yersinia pestis. There are 3 forms of plague. The first is bubonic plague, which affects the lymph nodes. You develop a fever, headaches, muscle aches that are almost unbearable. Your lymph nodes in your groin, your armpits, your neck become grotesquely swollen. These swellings are called buboes, and they can grow to the size of an apple or a plum. They turn dark, purple and black. They burst and leak pus and blood. The pain is agonizing. Within a week, half of those infected will be dead. The second form is septicemic plague, which enters the bloodstream directly. Your blood begins to clot throughout your body. Your fingers and toes turn black, they are dying, rotting while you're still alive. Your skin develops dark purple blotches as the tissue beneath dies. Blood oozes from every opening in your body. You lose your mind to the fever. You die in agony. The third form is pneumonic plague, which affects the lungs. You begin to cough. Your lungs fill with blood. You cough that blood up onto anyone near you, and through that cough, you transmit the plague to them. This is the only form of plague that spreads from human to human directly. It's also the fastest. You can go from healthy to dead in 2 days. The medieval world had no answer to any of this. Physicians prescribed bloodletting, which weakened patients further. They applied leeches to the buboes, hoping to draw out the infection. They burned aromatic herbs to try to purify the air. They bled the sick, burned their clothes, locked up the infected, none of it mattered. The plague was remorseless and unstoppable. In some cities, the death toll reached 50% of the population. In some places, it was 70% or more. There were not enough healthy people left to bury the dead. Mass graves were dug. Bodies were stacked in layers, one on top of another. The smell of decomposition hung over entire regions like a miasma that the physicians believed was itself the cause of the plague. Entire families died. Entire professions were wiped out in some cities. The plague took the lives of every physician and surgeon. Villages were abandoned because there was no one left alive to maintain them. The social order began to break down. People turned on each other. Some blamed the Jews and began pogroms of horrifying violence. Others believed the world was truly ending, that this was the final judgment spoken of in the Bible. Some people gave in to despair and hedonism. If the world was ending anyway, why not abandon all moral restraint? Others became deeply religious, seeing the plague as a test of faith. They walked through the streets whipping themselves with knotted ropes, drawing their own blood, believing that suffering might somehow appease God's wrath. But what was truly remarkable was that some people survived. Not because of medicine was useless against the plague, but perhaps because of luck. Perhaps because they happened to live in an area where the rats didn't penetrate as deeply. Perhaps because they had naturally stronger immune systems. Perhaps because they fled the city early and avoided exposure. For reasons that medieval people couldn't possibly understand, some survived while others all around them died. The Black Death killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people across Eurasia and North Africa. It is considered one of the most devastating pandemics in human history. In Europe alone, the population was cut in half. The world was fundamentally changed by the plague. Labor became scarce, so survivors suddenly found themselves valuable. The old feudal system began to break down. The church's authority was damaged. If God's ministers could not stop this plague, how could they be trusted to guide souls? And the plague never truly went away. For the next 3 centuries, it returned in waves. Every few decades, another outbreak would sweep through a region, killing thousands, reminding people that the plague was still lurking, still waiting, still capable of reducing the world to chaos and death in a matter of months. You are a woman in medieval Europe. You are young, perhaps 16 or 17 years old. You have been married for less than a year, often to a man you barely know. And now, your body is telling you that you are going to become a mother. Your mother and her mother before her have warned you about this moment. They have told you stories that terrify and fascinate you in equal measure. Stories of women who survived childbirth only to be left crippled by it. Stories of women who didn't survive at all. Stories that never quite explain what exactly happens, but make clear that what is about to happen to your body will be unlike anything you have experienced before. As your pregnancy progresses through the months, you feel the weight of your growing child. Your back aches constantly. Your feet swell so much that your shoes no longer fit. You're exhausted in a way that no amount of sleep can cure. Your appetite is strange. Sometimes you're ravenously hungry. Sometimes the sight of food makes you feel sick. A physician is called to examine you. He asks to see your urine. He studies it carefully and declares that all is well. Your humors appear to be in reasonable balance given your condition. He prescribes certain foods and herbs to prepare your body for birth. He tells you to avoid exertion and yet also to take walks to keep your strength. The advice is contradictory and vague, but it is the best that medieval medicine can offer. The midwife in your community is an older woman who has attended perhaps hundreds of births. She is respected or feared, depending on whether the births she attended resulted in living mothers and healthy babies. Some midwives have reputations as healers and wise women. Others are viewed with suspicion, accused sometimes of witchcraft if too many of their charges died. As your delivery date approaches, you feel a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. You want to meet your child, but you also know on a level deeper than words that the birth process itself is dangerous. Medieval women die in childbirth at rates that would be considered catastrophic by modern standards. In Florence in the 1500s, giving birth was responsible for about 1 in 5 deaths of married women. Your chances of surviving this are good. Most women do survive, but the risks are real and they are significant. Then one morning, you feel it. A tightening across your abdomen, then another, and another. You know what this means. Your time has come. You tell your husband. He immediately leaves the house. Men are not present at childbirth in the medieval world. This is women's business. The midwife is sent for. Your mother comes. Female relatives and neighbors begin to arrive. They will stay with you throughout the entire ordeal. Their presence is comforting and also somewhat chaotic. There are women giving you advice, women praying, women boiling water and tearing cloth into strips for bandages. The contractions begin in earnest. What started as manageable tightening becomes intense, focused pain. It begins in your lower back and radiates around to your front, a band of pressure that seems to want to split you in half. The pain peaks, then subsides, then returns. You have been in labor for perhaps 2 hours. You don't yet realize this might go on for another 10 or 15 or 20 hours. The midwife examines you. She inserts her hand inside you to determine how much your cervix has opened. The touch is not gentle. It's clinical and practical. She tells you, based on what she feels, how much longer this is likely to take. Her estimate means little. Some births move quickly, others move with agonizing slowness. The medieval birthing chamber is dimly lit. Candles flicker in the corners. The shutters are closed despite the heat, because medieval people believed that air was dangerous to a woman in labor. The smell of sweat, blood, and desperation hangs heavy in the room. There are no anesthetics available. Women endure labor without anything to dull the pain except perhaps alcohol, which they might drink in quantities large enough to make them slightly drunk. Hours pass. Your contractions grow more intense. You are now in what modern medicine would recognize as active labor. The pain is extraordinary. It fills your entire world. You have forgotten what it felt like to not be in pain. You cry out. Some medieval women are reported to have screamed so loud that they could be heard throughout the house and even into the street. The midwife prepares you for delivery. You are helped onto a special birthing stool or onto the bed. Some midwives position the laboring woman on her hands and knees. Others have her lie on her side. Medieval physicians recommended different positions depending on the situation. Sometimes they suggested that a fat woman should lie on her stomach and draw her knees toward her chest with a cushion under her belly. Then comes the urge to push. Your body simply takes over. You cannot resist it any more than you could resist breathing. With each contraction, you bear down with every ounce of strength you have. The pain reaches levels you didn't know existed. You think you will tear apart. You think you will die. Perhaps you wish you would. The midwife watches carefully. She sees the top of your baby's head appearing. She guides your pushing. She tells you when to push and when to stop, when to breathe and when to strain. She has done this 100 times. She knows what's normal and what's dangerous. If something is going wrong, if the baby is breech, if it's too large to pass through the birth canal, if the umbilical cord is wrapped around its neck, she has to make decisions with no medical support, no ultrasounds to guide her, no possibility of emergency intervention if things go truly wrong. But miraculously, your baby comes. After hours of labor and minutes of intense pushing, your child is born. The midwife catches the baby and immediately hands it to an attendant to clean and wrap. She then turns her attention back to you because your ordeal is not yet finished. The placenta must be delivered. The umbilical cord is cut tied with soft woolen thread rather than clamped. You continue to have contractions as your body expels the afterbirth. These contractions, while less intense than before, are still painful. The midwife watches carefully. If the placenta doesn't come out, if part of it is retained inside you, you risk infection and death. Once the placenta is delivered, you are helped to lie down. You are exhausted beyond measure. Your entire body aches. You are bleeding heavily. Medieval midwives did not have methods to control excessive postpartum bleeding beyond applying pressure and hoping it would stop on its own. Some women bled to death in the hours after delivery. Others developed infections from tears that were not properly cleaned. Others survived, but were left permanently damaged, with weakened pelvic muscles, with chronic pain, with injuries that would plague them for the rest of their lives. But you have survived. Your baby has survived. This alone is reason for celebration in a medieval community. The women cry out in joy. Your husband is told the good news. He comes to see his child. The newborn is taken to be baptized almost immediately, because medieval people know that infants are fragile and can die at any moment, and they don't want their child to die without being baptized. Now begins your lying-in period. For the next 4 to 6 weeks, you are confined to your chamber. Medieval people believed that a woman was vulnerable after childbirth, both physically and spiritually, and that she needed this time to recover and reconnect with her body. You stay in bed, attended to by female relatives and the midwife. You are fed broth and mild foods. Your wounds are left to heal. Your strength gradually returns, and your baby lies in a cradle nearby. If you are wealthy, it's a well-made wooden cradle lined with soft cloth. If you're poor, it might be a simple basket. Your child is swaddled tightly, a practice believed to support and protect the baby's fragile limbs. The swaddling also makes it easier to carry the baby and to keep it warm. Medieval childbirth was an ordeal that every woman faced with a mixture of fear and resignation. It was dangerous. It was painful beyond the experience of most modern women who have pain relief available. But it was also profound. It was the entry of new life into the world. And despite the risks and the suffering, medieval women endured it because the alternative, the end of their family line, was unthinkable. You wake one morning with a pain in your mouth. It starts as a low ache, barely noticeable. By noon, it's more pronounced. By evening, it's consuming your thoughts. You can barely eat. You can barely sleep. The pain pulses in rhythm with your heartbeat, a constant reminder that something is wrong inside your mouth. This is the medieval toothache. And in a world without dentists and without anesthesia, it is a particularly cruel form of suffering. You try home remedies first. You rinse your mouth with herbal solutions. Clove oil, which has mild numbing properties, is placed directly on the tooth. You chew on certain herbs, hoping for relief. You pray to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of teeth and dental pain. For a day or two, you hold out hope that the pain will pass on its own. But it doesn't. The pain grows worse. Now your entire jaw aches. Your cheek swells. You suspect that an abscess has formed a collection of pus at the root of the tooth. You finally accept that you need to do something more serious. You go to the barber. Not the barber in the sense we understand it today, a specialist in hair care, but the barber surgeon, one of the most common medical practitioners of the medieval world. This man combines several professions in one. He cuts hair and shaves beards. He performs bloodletting and the application of leeches. He lances boils and drains abscesses. He pulls teeth. He performs minor surgical procedures. And he does most of this with the same tools. The barber shop itself is likely in a visible location on the main street of your town or village. It's identified by the famous red and white pole, a pole that originally symbolized bandages, white, and blood, red, referencing the barber's dual role as both a hair cutter and a medical practitioner. When you enter, you see the tools of the trade: razors, lancets, extractors, and various surgical implements. The smell is of soap and human waste, of old blood that hasn't been properly cleaned from the instruments. The barber examines your tooth. He presses on it. He has you bite down on different points to locate the source of the pain. His diagnosis is straightforward. The tooth is infected and must be extracted. You already knew this, but hearing it confirmed is still terrifying. There is no anesthesia except perhaps strong drink. The barber might offer you alcohol, perhaps a strong ale or wine. You drink it hoping that it will numb the pain or at least make you not care about the pain as much. It barely helps. The extraction tool is placed on your tooth. It's a gruesome thing, a metal elevator designed to loosen the tooth in the socket, or a forceps designed to grip the tooth and pull it out. The barber applies pressure. The pain is extraordinary. It's a different kind of pain than the toothache, sharper, more acute, more directional. It feels as though your entire tooth is being torn out of your face. The tooth doesn't come free on the first attempt. The barber tries again. Your jaw is clenched, your muscles taut with tension. Your hands grip the arms of the chair. The barber continues to work. After the second or third attempt, the tooth finally comes free, but it often comes free in pieces. Fragments might remain in the socket. More work is needed to extract all of it. Once the tooth is finally, fully removed, the barber addresses the wound. He uses rough cloth to apply pressure and try to stop the bleeding. He might apply various substances intended to aid healing, herbs, salves, or perhaps even cauterization with a heated metal implement. The risk of infection is enormous. The barber's tools are not sterilized. They're not even particularly clean. Fragments of tooth remain in the socket. The wound is vulnerable to infection. You leave the barber's chair with your jaw throbbing, your mouth tasting of blood, and a hole where your tooth used to be. For the next few days, the pain continues. Eating is difficult. Speaking is uncomfortable. You watch anxiously to see if the wound becomes infected. If it does, if the socket develops an abscess, or if the infection spreads, you could develop a serious illness. But most of the time, the wound heals, and you're left with one fewer tooth. Medieval people lost teeth frequently. Decay was common because of their diet high in grains and lacking in fresh vegetables and proper nutrition. Tooth extraction was a common procedure. By the time a medieval person reaches old age, they might have very few teeth remaining. And yet, tooth extraction was not the only dental procedure that barbers performed. They also attempted to fill cavities. The technique was crude and the materials were unsuitable. Metal was sometimes packed into the cavity. Sometimes plant material was used. Sometimes herbs and plant resins were applied. These fillings were temporary at best, and the pain of having them placed was often considered worse than just accepting the cavity. The barber surgeon was a figure of both respect and fear in the medieval community. He had to be brave and dexterous. He had to be willing to cause pain in the short term to try to achieve healing in the long term. He had limited knowledge, but was often the only option available to a person suffering, and his patients endured procedures that by modern standards would be considered torture. You fall from a horse, or you're hit by a falling beam, or you're caught in some other accident. The bone in your leg breaks, you hear the crack, and immediately feel a pain so intense that you nearly lose consciousness. Your leg is wrong. It's bent at an angle that legs should not bend. You know immediately that something terrible has happened. Someone runs to fetch the bone setter or the surgeon. In the medieval world, these are not highly educated men. They're not physicians. Physicians consider themselves too educated and refined to actually perform surgery. They're practitioners who have learned their craft through apprenticeship and experience. Their knowledge comes from trial and error, from treating hundreds of broken bones and learning what works and what doesn't. The bone setter arrives. His first task is to realign the broken bone. This process is called reduction, and in the medieval world, it is performed without anesthesia except for perhaps alcohol or opium, neither of which work particularly well. The bone setter grasps your leg and applies traction, pulling on the leg to extend it and try to align the broken ends of the bone. The pain is indescribable. You scream. Your family holds you down. The bone setter continues pulling, adjusting, working the bone fragments back into approximate alignment. Once the bone is reasonably aligned, he must immobilize it to allow it to heal. Medieval bone setters have developed sophisticated splinting techniques. They understand the principles of immobilization, even if they don't understand the science behind why it works. A splint is constructed around your leg. It might be made from wooden staves. It might be made from woven reeds. In wealthier medieval societies, more sophisticated casting materials were developed. Medieval Italian physicians created casts from egg white and flour, a mixture that would harden into a structure that both immobilized and protected the leg. Sometimes animal fat was added to the mixture. Later, waxed cloth and parchment were used. The splint or cast is wrapped tightly around your leg. The tightness is uncomfortable, but it's necessary. The goal is to prevent any movement of the fractured bone. Any motion will prevent healing and could cause complications. Now comes the hardest part of recovery waiting. Medieval bone setters understood that healing took time. For a simple fracture, it might take 6 to 8 weeks. For a more severe break, it could take several months. During all this time, you must remain as still as possible. The splint cannot be removed except to be cleaned or reapplied. The itch beneath the splint is maddening. You cannot scratch it. You cannot reach the skin to clean it. After weeks, the skin beneath the splint begins to smell. It becomes infected. Sometimes the infection is minor, just surface bacteria causing irritation. Sometimes it's more serious. The bone setter checks on you regularly. He examines your leg without removing the splint. He listens to your description of pain and swelling. He looks for signs of infection or complications. If the pain increases significantly, or if your leg becomes hot and swollen, it might indicate that the bone was not properly aligned or that an infection has developed. And there's always the risk that the bone won't heal properly. If the fracture was severe, if the bone fragments were too displaced, the bone might heal in an improper position. The result could be a permanently shortened or crooked limb. If you're fortunate, this is merely a cosmetic issue. If you're unfortunate, it could make the limb functionally useless. When the bone setter finally removes the splint, a process that is itself painful, as the skin underneath is sensitive and raw, you see your leg. It's pale. It's thin from weeks of disuse. The skin is damaged. Moving it causes pain. You must gradually rebuild strength and range of motion. Most medieval people recover from broken bones. The human body is remarkably resilient, but some don't recover fully. Some are left with permanent limps or pain. Some develop infections that spread, requiring amputation. And amputation in the medieval world, without antibiotics, without pain relief, with crude surgical instruments, is often a death sentence. In the year 1078, or perhaps 1029, or perhaps in some other year where records are unclear, a strange plague afflicts a region of medieval France. People begin to experience a burning sensation in their limbs. This sensation is extraordinarily painful. It feels as though their limbs are on fire, even though they appear normal to observers. Medieval people call this affliction St. Anthony's fire or holy fire. The victims describe their agony in terms that suggest an internal conflagration. Their legs burn. Their arms burn. The sensation is so intense that some sufferers become delirious from the pain. Some go mad. Some take their own lives to escape the suffering. As the disease progresses, the burning sensation becomes localized. The fingers and toes begin to blacken. The tissue literally dies while the person is still alive. Gangrene sets in. The blackened digits begin to fall away from the body. Limbs must be amputated to prevent the infection from spreading. And through all of this, the person remains conscious, remains aware of what is happening to their body, remains in agony. Medieval people didn't understand what was causing this terrible plague. They prayed to St. Anthony, the patron saint of disease. They made pilgrimages to his shrines, hoping for miraculous healing. Some people did recover. Either the disease ran its course naturally, or perhaps the placebo effect of religious faith provided psychological relief. But many didn't recover. They died in agony, or they lived as amputees, their bodies destroyed by this mysterious fire that burned from within. It wasn't until centuries later that scientists discovered the true cause of St. Anthony's fire. It was ergotism poisoning caused by a fungus that grows on rye grain. The fungus is called Claviceps purpurea, and it produces alkaloids that are extraordinarily toxic to the human nervous system. Picture yourself as a medieval farmer in a cold, wet year. The winter has been harsh. The spring has been unusually damp. Your rye crop has been affected by cold, wet conditions that promote the growth of this fungus. You harvest the rye, not knowing that hidden among your grain are dark, ergot-infected kernels. They look like small, hard, black fingers sticking out of the seed heads. You take your rye to the miller. The miller grinds it into flour. Some of the ergot kernels are ground into the flour along with the grain. The ergot is now distributed throughout your bread. You bake the bread. You eat it. And over the next few days and weeks, you consume the toxins produced by the ergot fungus. The symptoms can take days or weeks to appear. At first, you might just feel ill. You have stomach pain, nausea, and vomiting. Then comes the burning sensation. It typically starts in your extremities, your fingers and toes. The burning is intense and constant. Nothing relieves it. No poultice, no herbal remedy, no amount of prayer makes it stop. Medieval physicians didn't know about ergotism. They thought it was a curse or a divine punishment or evidence of demonic possession. They prescribed bloodletting. They prescribed laxatives to purge the evil humors. They burned herbs and performed religious rituals. None of it helped because the problem was physical, a toxin in the bread that was causing actual neurological damage. In severe cases, the ergot toxins cause vasoconstriction. The blood vessels constrict and don't allow blood to flow properly. Without blood flow, the tissue dies. The fingers and toes turn black. This gangrenous tissue falls away from the body. Survivors are left as amputees, having lost fingers, toes, noses, or even entire limbs. The worst epidemics of ergotism killed tens of thousands of people. In France, in the year 1078, an outbreak killed approximately 10,000 people and affected many more with permanent injury. Communities where rye was the primary grain were hit hardest. But the disease wasn't limited to rye. It could also affect barley, oats, and wheat, though rye was most commonly affected because it was the grain most often grown in cold, damp regions where the ergot fungus thrived. It wasn't until the 1800s that governments began to mandate field drainage and crop sanitation to prevent ergot contamination. It wasn't until the 20th century that ergotism essentially disappeared from developed nations. But for nearly 1,000 years, it was a regular plague in medieval Europe, a mysterious burning disease that killed and maimed thousands of people, all because of a fungus growing on rye grain. Perhaps no medical practice in the medieval period was more widespread, more trusted, and more fundamentally wrong than bloodletting. It was prescribed for almost everything. Fever, bloodletting. Excessive joy or excitement, bloodletting. Melancholy or depression, bloodletting. Madness, bloodletting. Headache, heart palpitations, inflammation, weakness, anything really, the answer was the same. Balance your humors by removing blood. The theory was that blood carried the excess humor that was causing the imbalance. Remove the blood, and you remove the problem. It was logical, and it was wrong. Bloodletting was performed in several ways. The most common method was venesection, the opening of a vein with a sharp lancet and allowing the blood to drain into a vessel. The vein was usually in the arm, often the inner elbow. The barber or physician would tie a tourniquet above the vein to make it swell and become more visible. Then they'd make an incision. For a patient, the initial cut was sharp but not unbearable. But then came the waiting for the blood to drain, sometimes for several minutes, sometimes for longer. Another method involved the application of leeches. These were aquatic worms that would attach to the skin and suck blood. 3 to 10 leeches might be applied to a patient. They would feed until they were full, then drop off. The wound they left behind would continue to bleed for hours. Medieval physicians believed this was beneficial. They thought the leeches knew exactly how much blood needed to be removed and would stop when the proper amount had been taken. In reality, the leeches were purely opportunistic. They took as much blood as they could get. A third method was cupping. A heated cup was applied to the skin, creating suction that drew blood to the surface. Sometimes the skin under the cup was first cut, so that as the cup drew up, it drew blood. The resulting bruises and wounds were believed to release the trapped evil humors through the skin. The amount of blood removed could be staggering. A single patient might have 20 to 30% of their blood volume removed in one session. Some patients were bled multiple times in a single day for a chronic condition. The resulting weakness was attributed to the illness, not to the treatment. If the patient recovered, the bloodletting was credited with the cure. If the patient died, the conclusion was simply that the disease had been too strong. The irony is devastating. Bloodletting was so universal and so accepted that physicians competed on their ability to predict exactly how much blood a patient needed. They based these calculations on the patient's age, weight, and condition. They had entire tables charting the correct amounts to remove for different ailments. They were doing pseudoscience on a massive scale, confident in procedures that were actively harming their patients. But here's what's fascinating. Some people did get better after being bled, not because of the bloodletting itself, but because of other factors. Some fever-causing conditions do resolve naturally over time. The patient recovered despite the bloodletting, not because of it. But medieval physicians took this as confirmation that their theory was correct. Every success was proof that bloodletting worked. Every failure was proof that the disease was simply too strong. Bloodletting was so deeply embedded in medieval medicine that it persisted for centuries, even after physicians began to question its effectiveness. It wasn't until the 19th century that bloodletting finally began to fall out of favor, and it wasn't officially abandoned until the 20th century, when modern medicine finally demonstrated conclusively that it did more harm than good. Think about that. For over 1,000 years, physicians were systematically removing blood from sick patients, weakening them, and calling it medicine. For over 1,000 years, patients submitted to this treatment because the physicians assured them it would help. For over 1,000 years, the accumulated weight of medical authority and tradition prevented anyone from stopping and asking the fundamental question, is this actually making people better? It would be unfair to suggest that medieval physicians were simply ignorant or willfully harmful. Many of them genuinely believed they were helping. They were working within the framework of knowledge available to them, trying to apply logic and observation to understand diseases that had no visible cause. Medieval physicians did have some correct understandings. They understood that cleanliness mattered, even if they didn't understand why. Some physicians recommended washing before medical procedures. Some advised patients to keep their wounds clean. They understood that dirty conditions led to worse outcomes, even if they attributed this to miasmas and evil air rather than to bacteria. Medieval physicians also understood that certain herbs had medicinal properties. Willow bark contains salicin, which is chemically similar to aspirin and does reduce fever. Garlic has antibacterial properties. Honey has antimicrobial effects and promotes wound healing. Medieval herbalists, working through trial and error and accumulated observations, had identified many plants with genuine medical benefits. Their herbal remedies, while crude and unreliable compared to modern medicine, were often more effective than the bloodletting and other harmful treatments. Medieval physicians also understood the importance of diet and exercise. They recommended that patients eat appropriate foods for their condition, maintain reasonable physical activity, and avoid extremes of heat and cold. These recommendations, while not addressing the root causes of most medieval diseases, were at least not actively harmful. Some medieval physicians were genuinely innovative. In the medieval Iberian Peninsula and the Islamic world, surgeons developed sophisticated surgical techniques. They performed cataract surgeries. They understood wound closure and developed methods for sewing wounds with different types of sutures. They developed procedures for treating burns. They understood the importance of speed in surgery and could perform complex operations in minutes rather than hours. Medieval physicians also kept records. They wrote down what treatments they used and what outcomes they achieved. These records survive today and provide evidence of genuine medical thinking and experimentation, not mere superstition. Medieval physicians argued about the correct approaches to treatment. They disagreed about the best herbal remedies, the proper techniques for bloodletting, and the correct interpretation of urine samples. They were trying to build a systematic understanding of medicine, even if the system they were building was fundamentally flawed. And yet, despite this genuine effort, medieval medicine remained fundamentally ineffective. The brilliant Hippocratic theory of humor, inherited from ancient Greece, was simply wrong. The procedures based on this theory, while logical within the framework of that theory, were often harmful. The lack of understanding about germ theory meant that the most common causes of death, infections from wounds, contaminated water, poor sanitation, could not be addressed. The lack of effective pain relief meant that surgical procedures, while sometimes necessary, were ordeals of agony. Medieval physicians were doing their best with the knowledge available to them, but their best was not very good. The medieval world was a world where a person with a simple cut or an infected wound might die from sepsis. It was a world where childbirth was a regularly fatal event. It was a world where epidemics could wipe out half a population before anyone understood what was spreading the disease. And no amount of bloodletting, herbal remedies, or prayer could change that fundamental reality. So here we are, at the end of this long journey through the diseases and medical practices of the medieval world. What have we learned? What does this strange, painful, desperate world of the Middle Ages teach us about ourselves and about the human condition? First, we've learned that medieval people were not so different from us. They feared death just as we do. They loved their children just as we do. They endured suffering with remarkable courage and resilience. They tried to understand their world, tried to find ways to heal the sick, tried to prevent disease and suffering. They were not backward or primitive or stupid. They were ordinary people working with extraordinary limitations. We've learned that the history of medicine is not a simple progression from ignorance to knowledge, from darkness to light. It's more complicated than that. Medieval physicians had genuine insights about medicine and health, but they were constrained by incorrect fundamental theories, the theory of humors, the belief in miasmas that prevented them from seeing the truth about disease and its causes. And they were constrained by the tools available to them. Without microscopes, without understanding of chemistry, without germ theory, without antibiotics, they simply could not solve most of the medical problems they encountered. We've learned the human cost of living in a world without modern medicine. 1 in 3 children died before reaching adulthood. Women die regularly in childbirth. Epidemics could appear suddenly and kill half a population before disappearing just as mysteriously. A simple cut could become infected and lead to death. Tooth pain was an ordeal to be endured and then remedied through brutal extraction. This was not a romantic or poetic world. It was a world of constant danger, constant disease, constant suffering. And yet, people lived. They survived. They built civilizations and created art, music, and literature. They fell in love and raised families and pursued their trades and crafts. They did this against a backdrop of disease, suffering, and death that we in the modern world can barely imagine. Their resilience is humbling. We've also learned that we should be grateful for modern medicine. We take for granted abilities that would have seemed like miracles to medieval people. We can diagnose diseases without tasting urine or examining humors. We can treat infections with antibiotics. We can perform painless surgeries under anesthesia. We can have children with a reasonable expectation that both mother and child will survive. We can live our entire lives without losing teeth to decay or having fingers amputated from ergot poisoning. These are not small achievements. They are the product of centuries of scientific advancement and human suffering. But perhaps most importantly, we've learned that the medieval world was not alien to us. The diseases that killed medieval people are still around. Plague still exists. Dysentery still occurs in parts of the world without adequate sanitation. Measles and whooping cough still kill children in regions without access to vaccines. Childbirth still carries risks in the developing world. The only thing that has changed is that in the developed world, we have the medical technology to prevent or treat most of these conditions. The medieval world was a world where disease was normal and health was uncertain. It was a world where people died from conditions that we treat as minor nuisances. It was a world where healers did the best they could with the knowledge they had, but their best was often inadequate or even harmful. And yet those people persevered. They endured. They continued despite the suffering, despite the loss of loved ones, despite the lack of effective medicine. They continued because they had no choice, because they were human, because even in a world of disease and pain, there were still moments of joy and love and beauty. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps think for a moment about those medieval people. Think about the woman in labor, enduring hours of pain to bring new life into the world. Think about the child with measles, burning with fever, unable to understand what's happening to their body. Think about the elderly person with leprosy, watching their body slowly destroy itself, isolated from their family and community. Think about the physician doing bloodletting, confident that he's helping, not knowing that he's harming. Think about all those millions of people who lived and died before modern medicine existed. They endured. They survived. Some of them didn't survive, but their struggle matters. Their story is our story. We are the descendants of those people who lived through plague and childbirth and broken bones and infections. We are here because they survived despite the odds against them. Let that thought accompany you into sleep tonight. Be grateful for modern medicine. Be compassionate for those in our world who still lack access to basic health care. And remember that for most of human history, the challenges of disease and suffering were constants that people faced with courage and resilience. Sleep well, knowing that in this modern world, at least, you are safe from the medieval plagues. Sleep well, knowing that the medical innovations of centuries have freed us from so much suffering. Sleep well, knowing that you live in an age of miracles that medieval people would have recognized as such. This is the end of our story. Thank you for taking this journey through the medieval world with me. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe to the channel for more stories. Leave a comment telling me which medieval disease or treatment shocked you the most. And most importantly, thank you for watching. Good night and sweet dreams.